1945, Germany. An SS general stepped out of a Mercedes staff car. His black uniform was immaculate. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. The Knight's Cross hung around his neck. His country was defeated. His capital was rubble. His army was gone. He walked as if none of that mattered. He entered the American command post. He clicked his heels together with a sharp, loud crack. He raised his right arm in a crisp military salute. And he waited. He waited for the American officer behind the desk to stand up, to return the salute, to acknowledge that regardless of the outcome, they were both soldiers, both men of honor. The American officer put down his pen. He looked at the gleaming medals on the German's chest. Then, without a word, he stood up, turned his back, and walked to the window. The SS general's arm was still raised. His face turned red. The silence in the room was heavier than any physical blow. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't one soldier being rude. This was a direct order from General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. A deliberate, devastating, and brilliantly simple psychological weapon. An order to deny the Nazi elite the one thing they valued more than their own lives, their pride. This is the story of that order, how it came to be, why Eisenhower issued it, and the moment that turned a diplomat into a man who had zero tolerance left for Nazi arrogance. For generations, European generals believed war was a game played by gentlemen. When a defeated officer surrendered, the victor saluted him. They shook hands. They shared a drink. Even in the burning deserts of North Africa, British and American commanders had held a begrudging respect for German General Erwin Rommel. They treated captured officers like honorable men who had simply lost a chess match. By the spring of 1945, the Nazi High Command expected this tradition to continue. They expected to sit across from men like Eisenhower and Patton, drink fine whiskey, discuss battlefield tactics, sign some papers, retire to comfortable quarters. They expected respect. What they received instead was pure, devastating silence. Because the war in Europe was not a gentleman's war, and the men in the black uniforms of the SS were not soldiers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a hot-headed man. Unlike General Patton, who yelled, cursed, and carried ivory-handled revolvers, Eisenhower was a quiet, calculating strategist, a diplomat, a man who believed in rules, order, and international law. On April 12, 1945, that changed forever. General Patton's Third Army had just liberated a place called Ohrdruf, a sub-camp of the Buchenwald concentration camp system. When Eisenhower received the reports of what was found inside, he made a decision. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He drove to the camp with General Patton and General Omar Bradley. What they found inside the barbed wire defied human comprehension. The camp was littered with the skeletal remains of thousands of innocent people. Piles of unburied corpses lay rotting in the spring sun. the survivors who approached the American generals were little more than living ghosts, their eyes hollow, their bodies ravaged by starvation and unimaginable torture. The smell of death was so overpowering that battle-hardened General Patton walked behind a building and vomited. But Eisenhower did not look away. His face turned pale. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. He forced himself to walk through every single corner of that hell. He walked through the execution sheds. He looked at the instruments of torture. He stared directly into the faces of the dead. He wanted every ounce of that horror burned into his memory forever. He turned to the American soldiers standing nearby. His voice was trembling with cold, controlled fury. Get the cameras. Get the films. Get the witnesses. Because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say this never happened. In that moment, standing in the ashes of Ohrdruf, Eisenhower's diplomacy died. His respect for the German military hierarchy completely evaporated. He realized that the men he was fighting were not opposing soldiers. They were not honorable adversaries. They were monsters. And the generals and SS commanders who led them were the architects of a slaughter factory. In the days that followed, the Third Reich collapsed. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. The German military surrendered. Thousands of high-ranking Nazi officials, SS commanders, and Wehrmacht generals began flowing into American prisoner of war camps. But they did not walk in with their heads bowed in shame. 12 years of psychological conditioning had convinced these men they were the master race. Even in total defeat, they remained staggeringly arrogant. They arrived at American checkpoints in Mercedes staff cars. They brought multiple suitcases filled with tailored uniforms, expensive wines, and stolen artwork. They brought junior officers to act as personal butlers. When they stepped out of their vehicles, they demanded to see the commanding American officer. They expected to be escorted to comfortable private quarters. They expected to sign a few documents, shake hands, and be treated like royalty in exile. One prominent example was General Hermann Bernhard Ramke. After surrendering, he arrogantly demanded to be taken directly to the highest-ranking American general so he could formally and honorably hand over his pistol. He expected a ceremony. He expected cameras to capture his dignified surrender. But news of the concentration camps had spread through the American ranks like wildfire. From the highest generals down to the lowest private, every American soldier had seen the photographs. Many had walked through the camps themselves. The American military had zero tolerance left for Nazi arrogance. Before we get to Eisenhower's order, and the moment it shattered the Nazi ego completely, take a second to subscribe to Secret War Journal. We tell the stories behind the moments that changed history. the decisions made in quiet rooms that shaped the world we live in. Hit subscribe now so you never miss one. When word reached Eisenhower that captured SS commanders were demanding military courtesies, he issued a directive that would devastate the German elite. Eisenhower officially suspended the traditional rules of military honor when dealing with the SS and the Nazi high command. Patton, disgusted by what he had seen at the camps, agreed completely. The order was brilliantly simple, yet psychologically devastating. No handshakes, no returning of salutes, no fraternization, no friendly conversations. If a captured SS general raised his hand to salute, American soldiers were ordered to ignore it completely, to look right through the German officer as if he didn't exist. If the German demanded to speak to a commander, the Americans were to simply turn their backs. To a civilian, ignoring a salute might sound like a minor insult. But to a lifelong Nazi military officer whose entire identity was tied to his rank and uniform, it was a death blow to his soul. When these arrogant Nazi generals marched into American command posts waiting for a salute, they were met with dead silence. American soldiers, dirty, exhausted, and traumatized by what they had seen in the camps, simply stared at them, then turned around and walked away. The psychological impact was profound. For 12 years, these men had been treated like gods. Wherever they walked, people snapped to attention. People feared them. People obeyed them. Their uniform was a shield of absolute power. But in front of American soldiers, that uniform meant nothing. It was just a piece of dirty cloth. When Nazi generals demanded special food, the Americans threw standard prison rations at their feet. When they demanded private quarters, they were shoved into crowded, muddy pens. When they demanded to keep their personal servants, the Americans laughed and handed them a shovel. The Americans did not need to beat them. By simply turning their backs, the American military stripped these mass murderers of the one thing they valued more than their own lives: their pride. This cold, unyielding wall of disrespect went all the way to the top. Eisenhower himself led by example. When the Axis forces surrendered in North Africa in 1943, the top German commander, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, was captured. Von Arnim fully expected to be brought to Eisenhower's tent for a formal, gentlemanly meeting. A handshake, a drink, a soldier's acknowledgement between equals. Eisenhower flatly refused to see him. He told his aides to process the German general like any other prisoner and lock him up. Von Arnim was furious, completely insulted that the Supreme Commander wouldn't even look at him. But the most famous display of this cold justice happened during the final unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945 at Reims, France. The German delegation was led by General Alfred Jodl and Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg. They arrived to sign the documents that would end the bloodiest war in human history. They expected Eisenhower to be sitting at the table with them. But Eisenhower refused to be in the same room as them. He stayed in his private office while his subordinate officers handled the signing. He absolutely refused to share a table, a photograph, or a handshake with the men who had orchestrated the destruction of Europe and the genocide of millions. Only after the documents were officially signed were Jodl and Friedeberg brought into Eisenhower's office. The room was freezing cold. Eisenhower stood behind his desk. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He did not offer them a seat. He stared at the two defeated German commanders with eyes that could cut through steel. He asked one simple, blunt question. Do you understand the terms of this surrender? And are you prepared to carry them out? The German generals, stripped of all power and dignity, quietly answered, yes. Eisenhower didn't say another word. He nodded to the door. Get them out. The meeting lasted less than a minute. There was no honor, no mutual respect, no acknowledgement of their rank or service. Just the cold, hard reality that the master race had been utterly and completely crushed. General Eisenhower understood something fundamentally important about human psychology. He knew the men who ran the Nazi Empire were narcissists. They thrived on fear, respect, and authority. If the Americans had treated them like honorable prisoners of war, it would have validated their delusion. It would have told them that despite the concentration camps, despite the mass murder, despite the 6 million dead, they were still respected military men. Eisenhower refused to give them that validation. By ordering his men to turn their backs, by refusing to return their salutes, by treating them like invisible criminals, the American military completely dismantled the Nazi ego. They forced the SS commanders to look in the mirror and see what they actually were. Not supermen, not elite warriors, just pathetic, defeated criminals about to answer to the hangman. War is often remembered for its massive battles. The roar of artillery, the clash of tanks, the thunder of bombers. But sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield makes no sound at all. Sometimes the ultimate form of justice is looking an evil man in the eye and turning your back. Eisenhower didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to throw a punch. He just needed to remind these men, these architects of industrialized murder, that their uniforms, their medals, and their arrogance meant nothing. That history would not remember them as soldiers. It would remember them as what they were. And the silence of an American soldier turning his back said it louder than any words ever could. What do you think of Eisenhower's order? Was the silent treatment more devastating for the Nazi generals than any physical punishment could have been? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to see the full story of what happened at that surrender table in Reims, the moment Eisenhower refused to shake Jodl's hand and ended the war with 5 words. That video is next. Thanks for watching.